Last year I had a client call me up and he said, listen, I think I've made a huge mistake. I've paid a guy a couple of $100,000 for some gear and I can't get a hold of him. He's disappeared. This might sound outrageous, but it happens more often than you think. My clients were giving people, brokers, suppliers, other subcontractors, lots of money for deposits for things with nothing in writing. Hello, welcome to the Subbies Toolbox Podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Cirson. I'm a construction lawyer, a construction adjudicator, and the founder of the Subbies Toolbox. On today's episode, I want to talk you through what you do when you buy things in your subcontracting business and what you would do if you paid a lot of money for something and it just never turned up, or the person that you paid money to disappeared. This might sound outrageous, but it happens more often than you think. And in a big way, that's why builders are so gun shy on giving deposits to subcontractors, because they worry that you'll take the money and disappear. Listen, there's a really good way to make sure that you can be protected when you're buying things in your business, and also a really good way for you to ensure that you can give your builders peace of mind when they give you deposits. So I want to have a bit of a chat today about the different scenarios that unfold in subcontracting businesses and share some more stories with you about things that have gone bad for some of our Subbies Toolbox members. Now, the first thing that I think is important to point out is that sometimes when you buy things, you will be given the supplier's terms and conditions. So it's possible that you may have signed a credit application form with the likes of BlueScope or Colorbond or Bunnings or a big supplier that you might buy a lot of materials from. Those types of transactions will typically be governed by the credit application terms and conditions of the supplier. And you can actually go through those terms and conditions and make sure that they suit the scenario that you're operating under. If you have a special circumstance, don't be gun shy in saying to those suppliers, hey, listen, we need to have something in writing or a special letter or something to give our builder peace of mind that we've paid for these materials and that they're owned by the builder. So you do have wiggle room in those transactions with your suppliers. And a lot of subcontractors think that because you're buying something, that the most important thing that you have to do is prove to the person you're buying it from that you've got the money to pay. I wish the construction industry worked that way, because builders, if they approached life with that attitude, would be much nicer to subcontractors in every transaction that they did. But there is some merit in the caution that builders approach subcontractors in giving out deposits. But deposits are something that subcontractors rarely think they have any wiggle room in negotiating. So if your supplier is saying to you, hey, I'm not going to sell this to you unless you make a partial payment prior to having the goods delivered, then the subcontractors rarely have much wiggle room in terms of bargaining power to be able to say, no, you have to supply it to me. Particularly when the subcontractor wasn't the one that specified the materials or equipment or the supply item. It could have been specified at the head contract, and so the supplier knows that you have no choice but to buy it from them because they're specified under the head contract. But there are other ways in subcontracting businesses that you purchase things. And one of the ways that it came to light for me recently was last year I had a client call me up and he said, listen, I think I've made a huge mistake. I've paid a guy a couple of $100,000 for some gear and I can't get a hold of him. He's disappeared. And of course, my brain went to the worst case scenario straight away. And I said, hey, how often do you do this? Like, what do you mean you paid the guy a couple of $100,000? What for? And he explained to me that in his trade, they use a broker to buy gear from other subcontractors in the same trade. And over the years, they've used a particular broker. So all of the subcontractors in a particular trade go through a particular broker to buy and sell gear that they have. So it's a completely legitimate arrangement. And this broker is highly trusted in the industry by those tradespeople. So everyone in that particular trade really trusts this guy. My client had purchased gear through this broker before and trusted him and thought that the transaction was safe. And that's why I gave him a couple of $100,000. So it's not like my guy just woke up and had a a silly day or paid some dumb tax that day. He actually had a legitimate basis for believing that this guy would come good with the promise. But unfortunately, the broker had been involved in an incident and ended up in hospital. So we weren't able to get in contact with the guy when everyone went to his office. His office was closed. Nobody could get a hold of him. So when you have parted with a few $100,000 worth of money and the person that you're buying the goods off, you don't even know who it is. You haven't got that information. You're buying through a broker. That's where things can get really ugly really quickly. Now, it didn't take us long to find out through some common contacts that the broker was unwell and in hospital. And as soon as we were able to resolve that, quickly the broker was able to pass on the money that had been paid by our client to the supplier, and the goods were delivered. So that situation was completely averted and nothing to see here, so to speak. However, the issue that came to light for me was that so many of my subcontracting clients are doing transactions that I hadn't even thought of before. It really bothered me that my clients were giving people, brokers, suppliers, other subcontractors, lots of money for deposits for things and doing this wheeling and dealing trading with nothing in writing. And in those circumstances, there's ways that you can become a secured creditor, or effectively secure your entitlement to the money that you have given. So you can secure the money, but you can also secure your entitlement to the goods that you have purchased by way of that arrangement. And the most common way I find subcontractors can do this easily is by having purchase order terms and conditions. If you use purchase order terms and conditions whenever you do a transaction, it's no different to when somebody engages you and you might have put your terms and conditions on your quote and then they send you a purchase order. And yes, there is some wiggle room and muddy waters around the battle of the forms and whose terms and conditions will apply, but at least you have something in writing. And one of the most important things we include in our terms and conditions is the right for you to make registrations on the PPS register over the deposits that you have paid and the goods that you're purchasing as well. So if you have taken those steps, your ability to do something if somebody disappears is much greater. Say, for example, it was a different scenario and you'd purchased some equipment from a supplier and you had PPS registrations over that equipment, and the supplier went into liquidation a week later. So you've just effectively given someone a bunch of money and they've just appointed a liquidator, gone, thank you very much, I'll take your cash and I'm going to now appoint a liquidator. Now, if you've got your PPS registrations properly made over that equipment, you could go to the liquidator and assert your right to ownership of that equipment and effectively go and pick it up. So that's the type of arrangement that we recommend that you can talk to your builders about when they're giving you deposits, so that they can have peace of mind as well, just like you need peace of mind when you're buying materials and equipment. So purchase order terms and conditions can be incredibly beneficial if something goes pear-shaped. You actually have written terms and conditions that you can go to the other party or the liquidator, as the case may be, and say, hey, I've got rights here. I'm either entitled to the money or I'm entitled to the gear that I've purchased. Now, the other thing that you really need purchase order terms and conditions for is those subcontractors who might just go to site and do a tiny little bit of work. So in a lot of instances, subcontractors will engage, like you might just get a Franna crane, you might have a concrete pump that comes to site to do a tiny little bit of core fill. It could be the case that the subcontractor that you're engaging is, for the most part, a manufacturer and a supplier, and it might be a proprietary system that they're bringing to site to install, but when they come along and they install it, there is a connection component or an installation component that takes place. So if you have purchase order terms and conditions with those suppliers, it allows you to cover off on the terms and conditions you need for them to actually carry out work on site as well. So if you have robust, I call them the mother of all purchase order terms and conditions that we have in the Subbies Toolbox, is the ability to cover most scenarios with your purchase order terms and conditions, so that if you have a supplier that isn't requiring a written contract to come to site, you can engage them under a purchase order. Now, a lot of subcontracting businesses will take the approach that, look, anything under this many $1,000 we'll use a purchase order for. But I'm aware that you're using effectively the purchase order scenario comes about far more commonly than that. And it can be, like with my subcontractor who purchased gear through a broker, can be a scenario where a subcontract document is not appropriate, or a proper contract document that the builder would require you to sign. It's not appropriate for you to give that to your supplier. They're just simply not going to sign something like that. But if you issue them a purchase order, it's quite possible that they might just accept that purchase order and not look too deeply at the terms and conditions. So I'm not proposing we put anything nasty or untoward in those purchase order terms and conditions. More than anything, you need those baseline terms and conditions that will protect you in most scenarios for the transactions that you're doing in your business. So the first real assessment that I want you to think about if you're listening to this podcast today in terms of business risk is, when do I buy things from people where I don't have anything in writing? So what are those services or goods that I'm purchasing? And what is the scenario? How does that play out? So another really good example, one of our Toolbox members a couple of years ago was quite a big electrical company. They were doing work on a highway project, and they had to supply and install a very big LED sign, one of the big ones that goes up next to the highway. And that subcontractor had purchased the LED sign from a proprietary supplier of LED signs. So these manufacturers that make this specialist equipment. Now, they didn't have any purchase order terms and conditions. There was nothing in writing with this supplier. But one thing that they hadn't considered was that the sign was not just going to come from the proprietary manufacturer straight to the electrician. It actually had to go on a little bit of a holiday and get a specialist frame, a metal frame, for the sign to be installed over the highway. The frame had to be made up by a metalwork fabricator. So the sign didn't go directly from the supplier to the subcontractor and then the subcontractor took it to site. It actually went from the electrical manufacturer of the signs to a metalwork fabricator, and then the metalwork fabricator would effectively deliver it to site, and our subcontractor at that point would get possession of this sign. So nothing in writing, and what actually unfolded was that the manufacturer of the sign didn't pay the metalwork fabricator on time, and the manufacturer was in the course of their end of month pay run. They were a very big company. It took a little bit more time than it should have for that manufacturer to pay the metalwork fabricator, and the fabricator held that sign to ransom. Meanwhile, our electrical Subbies Toolbox member was under a contract with a very big tier 1 company that was doing a major project on a highway, and every single day that that sign was not released and delivered to site, our Subbies Toolbox member was getting in very big trouble from their client under the head contract. So you can see how there are scenarios where subcontractors are buying things where there's different circumstances that unfold. Perhaps it's that you're buying something, you have to pay a deposit, and you have to actually pay a third party for a different supplier to get something for you. A good example of that might be that you're paying a stone mason, and that stone supplier is buying a big block of stone from Italy, and that stone is actually going to be an international transaction that's going to get delivered into Australia to the port, and then the stonemason will take delivery of it, chop it all up, make it into bench tops, and then deliver it to site. So lots of different scenarios where the things that you're paying good money for, there's a lot that's got to happen in the background for that to actually arrive in your possession, for you to have the benefit of the thing that you have paid for. So purchase order terms and conditions, in my opinion, are the baseline requirement for what a subcontractor should have. It's quite simple for you to import those into your finance system. So if you're using JobPack or even Xero or any accounting software, it should have the ability for you to create a purchase order to give to a supplier. And just like when people buy things from you, that those purchase order terms and conditions get sent with the purchase order, and then they at least can apply in the circumstances of your transaction. Now, I have to obviously caveat that with there are times when your terms and conditions might be overridden by a later contract, and you might have signed up to credit application terms and conditions with a particular supplier like BlueScope or Colorbond or Bunnings or something like that, where even if you do give your purchase order terms and conditions, they're not completely going to override that credit application terms and conditions. But for the most part, if you are doing nothing at all and you don't have anything in writing when you are buying things in your subcontracting business, you really need to be getting some purchase order terms and conditions and making a company procedure that nothing is purchased, even a box of pencils. Use a purchase order. There are reasons why builders have these procedures in place to make sure they're protected when they give you deposits, and that's because they're big, sophisticated businesses that have access to resources and advice and other lawyers who probably are writing their purchase order terms and conditions for them. So as part of our Subbies Toolbox membership, we do have purchase order terms and conditions in our resource library for our Toolbox members. And one of the things, the mini projects that we recommend our Toolbox members do is that they download those terms and conditions and they go through our training in making sure that the purchase order terms and conditions that they are using cater to the specific situations where they are purchasing things. So for example, with the electrician who is purchasing very specialist equipment from a manufacturer, and then the goods that they are buying actually go on a little trip around the countryside before arriving at site. They never actually get delivered to their premises. So that is one scenario. Another scenario is our other subcontractor who had purchased gear for his subcontracting business through a broker. So he's paying a third party. Those scenarios really need to be catered to. And then the other supporting systems that you need in your business, which again does come up on our business risk checklist, is making sure that you've got systems and procedures for making registrations on the Personal Property Security Register. So we'll do another podcast about that so that you have a bit more details about what the Personal Property Security Register is and why it's important. But what I want you to take home from today's podcast is, what am I buying? Who am I giving money to? And what would I do? What would I have to rely on if that person disappeared? Hopefully this podcast was helpful. If you are listening to these series of podcasts and wondering where I'm getting these topics from, we have a business risk checklist. And at the moment, the topics that I'm coming up with are things that relate to the business risk checklist. So if you would like to download the checklist and do a little assessment of where your business is at with what bases you've got covered and what you don't, the business risk checklist will help you prioritize what you need to take action on in what order, because effectively different levers that you can pull at the different stages in your business journey that will make the most difference for you. So doing that risk assessment of where you are in business, what transactions you're doing, and what is a risk to your business now, and what you should prioritize. The business risk checklist will help you work that out. So it is a free download. I'm pretty sure we have the link to the checklist in the show notes. So just grab the checklist, have a look. It's only a couple of pages long and will help you work out what to do next. Thanks for sticking with me to the end of my podcast today. If you could benefit from a community of values-aligned subcontractors to manage your builder's contract and get paid on time, head on over to www.subbiestoolbox.com.au and check out our Subbies Toolbox membership. The Subbies Toolbox is not just a library of templates and resources. The real magic happens amongst our community of members, where we provide a safe and moderated space to share commercial street smarts and lessons learned from everyday struggles that are unique to commercial subcontracting businesses. So until next week, stay safe and get paid.